This is the first video of a new series that will teach you how to draw with tools like Illustrator, Photoshop and Procreate. Each time we will cover a specific style, genre or topic, and besides the tutorial, we will also provide downloadable exercise files and a way to share your work with us. We want to encourage you to practice these techniques no matter what's your skill level. This time we will create a self-portrait in Illustrator, inspired by the artwork from the popular Western game Red Dead Redemption 2. The first step was to take a few pictures that I can choose from. And the most important thing was to make sure that the lighting is similar to the artwork. Now let me show you first the artwork, because if you are not familiar with the game, you probably don't know the artwork either. So these are the characters from the game, and Red Dead Redemption 2 is a Western story set in 1899. We will see all the characters in those type of costumes and dresses. And the game itself is amazing, but these illustrations I love, and once I've seen them, I really wanted to create a tutorial to show you how to do these illustrations. What I love about this style is the high contrast and the low amount of colors used. So I'm just going to flick through a couple of these images. And I will probably just tap on this one for a second and zoom a bit even closer. So it's a high resolution image and it shows really well the line work. Now, I'm not 100% sure whether this artwork was created in Illustrator or Photoshop or other applications, but when I first saw it, it felt like it's a vector artwork in whatever tool it was used to create it. I might be wrong because there are some texture quality to it. So some of the edges look more like textured brushes that could be Photoshop, but I feel like this is something that can very nicely done in Illustrator. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So once I switch back to my artwork, you can see, it's not exactly the same because I'm not as good an illustrator as whoever did these artwork, but I tried to get to them as close as possible within a couple of hours work. So before I started, I wanted to make sure I have a good pose and a reference that I can use. And I decided to take pictures of myself because I could pose and set the lights up the way I wanted it. Although I also looked for references from other movies. So I was considering maybe using something like Django Unchained or other like famous Western movies and characters from that, and try to recreate them in this graphic style. But I settled with this photo, although I took a couple of other ones and I used a couple of props as well, but I decided that actually without the props it's fine because I can always add them later once I start the illustration. The important thing when I took the pictures was to make sure that the lighting is sort of similar to the graphic style. So we have a strong light on the left and we have a softer light from the right. So this is a very typical setup for a photo shoot, and I wanted to make sure that I match it as close as possible. Now I want to also show you that here in Lightroom I can jump back to the original raw photo. So this is how it looks, but when I switch back to the edited version, I increase the contrast and clarity and a lot of the options that we can find here in Lightroom. And this really helps to bring out most of the details that we need for the illustration. The most important details are the tonal values on the face, because this is what we will need to paint with different shades and colors in Illustrator. So these are very important. And by default, it was already visible, but I just made it even more prominent. So it will be helpful once we start doing the illustration. You can go even further, so I'm just going to exaggerate it. But if I drag the clarity all the way up and maybe even grab the contrast up here and drag that even further up, now you can see how much more graphic already it looks compared to the original. You want to really bring out every wrinkle, every little detail on the face that we can turn into details on the illustration. When you are ready here in Lightroom, you can send this to Photoshop by choosing File, Edit in Photoshop. And that's going to open up the file, and it will also save the final result that you create in Photoshop back into the Lightroom catalog. By the way, I'm using Lightroom CC, so it's the cloud version, but you can use either Lightroom applications for this starting point, and even Photoshop if you want. But once you have the image in Photoshop, it's good to separate it from the background. Now, if you have a busy background, you might find this a little bit more tricky. Luckily, I had a good white backdrop, and I'm using the select subject feature, which will separate myself from the background fairly well. Now, there's a couple of details here. I'm just going to use the quick selection tool to increase those parts a bit. And then once I'm ready, I will click on the mask icon here on the bottom right. Okay, so that separates me from the background. And at this point, you could refine the edges, but you don't really need to do that because we are only going to use this as a reference. Now, if you want to already apply colors similar to what we have in the artwork, you can do that. But once again, I find it best to keep it as is and just take this into Illustrator. So at this point, what I would normally do is to save this out. So I'm going to export it as a PNG. And now we can jump into Illustrator. Notice that I already have a couple of layers set up here. And by the way, this Illustrator template is something you can download. I have the link in the description below, so it can help you to get started and you don't have to worry about setting up anything. It will even have the colors. These colors I picked from the original artwork. I have the brightest color at the front, and then it goes to the darkest color. So if I just grab my swatches, you can see them in one line. If I drag them out a little bit further, something like that. And by the way, this is normally how I use the swatches panel to keep it always easy to access. And it's very important to have them set up in order, especially for the skin tones. So these are all the different shades for painting the skin. Now, we have this template ready, and notice that we have a layer here called photo. By the way, the background layer you can turn off and just keep the red layer on if you find it a bit too distracting while working on the illustration. It's up to you, whichever you prefer to use. So selecting the photo layer, we can go into File, Place, and then we just have to find that file that we exported, the PNG file. I'm going to place it in and then click and drag to place it down here. Let's just make this slightly bigger, something like that. Okay, so we have it placed here, and the reason why it looks like a ghost is because this layer is already set up as a tracing layer or a template, which means that if I double click on it, you can see it's set to dimming the image to 50%. Now this can be very useful, but for now I'm going to turn this option off so we can see the original colors. Now, the way I like to work in Illustrator when I have a reference is to keep a reference on one side and then work on the left side. But to make things easier for yourself, you can have two copies. So I'm just going to drag this one here, and I'm going to actually create an additional layer, and I'm going to put this version on the right to that layer. So I'm going to call this reference, like so. And on the left side, we have the photo, which I am going to set back to have the dim images set to 50%. So I'm using my photo twice. On the right side, it's just going to be the reference, which I can look at while I'm drawing. And on the left side, we have it set up to make sure that we are using the right proportions. And it can save you a lot of time to draw the outlines, and that way you don't have to worry about the details, whether they are the right size and right proportions. It's just going to make it easier for you. If you want a bit more challenge and you are good at illustration in general, you don't probably need this. You can just draw directly from the reference on the left side. So it's completely up to you. I'm going to show you the simpler way. So now that we have these set up, I can lock both of these layers with the little padlock icons, which means I won't accidentally move them around or make selections of them. And I'm going to start with the outlines layer. So that's, you can see I have 3 additional layers on top. First, we will start with the outlines, and this is where we start painting or drawing. I'm going to use the Blob brush. This is the tool that I most of the time work with in Illustrator when it comes to these type of illustrations. And this tool has a couple of settings. So if I double click on this, you can see it has a few options here. Now, the roundness you can set to 100%. It doesn't need to be squashed. It can be a round brush, but if you prefer to draw more with a calligraphic brush, you can also use a lower percentage here on the roundness. The angle doesn't really matter as long as it's 100% round. But what's very important is to make sure that you choose pressure. And for this, unfortunately, you will need to use a pen tablet. I'm using a Wacom Intuos in this example, but I was actually working on my Cintiq. Of course, that's much more comfortable because we have a big screen, or I have a big screen to work on, but it doesn't really matter. And Intuos or any pen tablet, to be honest, is good for this. So once you have a stylus, you can set the pressure for controlling the size. And if your size is higher, just make sure the variation is also set to the same size. So increase the variation to the maximum value there. The fidelity, I like to keep on the second bar here. So you can keep it on accurate as well, or slightly to the right. And I normally like to keep the keep selected option off. So when I click OK, these are the settings that I use. So it's very simple. And what you will need to do is to set the stroke to the color that you wish to work with. So with the blob brush, it's the stroke color that is important. And start with the darkest color. So I'm going to zoom a little bit closer and just zoom even closer. And I am going to start with maybe the nose. So let's select the blob brush. By the way, it's Shift B, the shortcut. And to change quickly the size of your brush, you can use the square brackets on the keyboard. There's also another setting worth mentioning. So I'm just going to show you how it looks. So that's how the blob brush is going to paint. And you can see already that if I press lightly and then press harder, it has a nice pressure sensitivity applied to it. One thing that's worth mentioning is that under the preferences, you can go into general, and within there, you will find this option called Use Precise Cursor. I highly recommend to turn this on because this is going to give you the way I am drawing. So instead of seeing the tool, which is very distracting, you just see an X at the center of your brush. So that's just so much easier to work with. Okay, there's a couple of additional settings as well, which I'm going to keep mentioning. So once you have this, you can increase, decrease the brush size with the shortcut I mentioned. And then what you need to do is to start drawing. Now, I am going to draw a few lines here just to show you how it works. So let's draw this line down here. And notice I'm trying to use my pressure sensitivity already. I'm going to draw these details up here for the eyes. I can draw the moustache and just draw it one by one. It is obviously time consuming, but you can see how it works. But there's a couple of tricks which I would like to show you. And of course, I won't be showing you the full drawing process. I'm going to jump to different stages because it takes long. It took me about 5 hours to do the final artwork. So one of the tricks that is worth remembering is when you draw with the blob brush, everything is automatically merging. So these shapes here you can see, although I've done it in 2 separate steps, are now merged together. So let me just zoom even closer just to make sure you can see it better. So let me make the brush a bit smaller. So if I draw this detail here, and then I want to fill it in with black, you don't have to paint over it like that. You just use your white arrow tool, the direct selection tool, click on the inner line of that shape, then press backspace and backspace again. And voila, it's filled in with the color. So we can do the same thing here on the right side just to practice it. I paint over it, select with the white arrow tool, A is the shortcut, and then backspace, backspace, delete, delete, and we have them filled in. So that's a simple trick with the blob brush that's worth remembering. Same thing with the eyes. We can just zoom closer, select the inner line. It's important not to click on the shape itself, because if you then press backspace, it's going to delete the whole object. You want to click on the inner line and then press backspace twice. Now you want to avoid painting over all the outlines. So you should be a bit subtle with the black line and outlines. You only want to define the most important lines. So if I keep drawing all these lines, and I'm just going to exaggerate it now, so I keep drawing everything here, it's going to look too much at the end. So I'm just going to draw this line here. Then I can draw the same thing I would draw on the right side. I can fill this one in as well. Once again, direct selection tool, delete, delete, and so on and so forth. This is already too much detail on the eyes that I wouldn't do this all in black. I would use the skin tones that we will have later for coloring to define the shading, and with the shading define the forms. So it's very important not to go too much overboard with the black. So black is your key color. It's really just for defining the most darkest and most prominent lines. So one problem could be that I would use the same color for even minor details, like painting around the lips. Now that's, again, why is it not a good idea? Because if you look at the photo reference, there's actually no prominent outline or contour line here. I would say probably this is the darkest bit of it. So if I really wanted to draw a line there, I would just draw it probably something like this and very thin. But what's more important is that we have this line here, which is much darker. So I can draw that with black. So this is the way I would work with the blob brush, but sometimes you might want to erase from the outlines. So let's say here, I feel like I need to remove a bit from the outlines. Remember, this is all going to be one object. So it completely joins it together because the blob brush works that way. It doesn't create strokes, it creates filled objects. So the best way to remove from them is a very similar brush. I would call it the twin sister or brother of the blob brush. It's the eraser tool. Shift-E is the shortcut for it. This tool also has the same options as the blob brush. If you double click on it, you can set it up. I'm not going to waste time repeating what I've already showed you. So I'm just going to zoom a bit closer here, and I am going to use the eraser to delete from these lines here. So you can see if I went too far and I made them too thick and too continuous, I can always delete from them. Even here on the top, if I want, I can delete into it a bit, and it already looks much more subtle. So you can switch back and forth between these two tools, or you can also create a new toolbar for yourself. So if you go into the window menu and choose toolbars, new toolbar, you can just call it illustration, like that. And there's the toolbar. We can just click on these three dots here and select the tools that we need. So for illustration, I would normally put the pen tool in there. Just drag and drop and place it in. But most importantly, for this example, we want to use the blob brush, and we want to use the paintbrush later on, and the eraser, let's not forget about that. That's a bit further down. Here it is, the eraser tool. So this is a handy mini toolbar that we can work with, and we can even attach it to the swatches panels. So if I drag it here, I can now move them together. Let me just keep that together. As you can see now, it moves together. Actually, I prefer to have it on the right side like that. So now we have everything set up. We can move on to the next stage, which is the coloring. So let me switch to my other document, which has already all the shading and details in it, but I'm going to turn off those layers for now. Okay, so this is how the outline looks like without the reference. If I turn it back, once again, you can see I work mainly on the hair and the beard, but on the face, I hardly use the black lines. So just very subtle amount of details around the eyes and the nose, but generally it's mainly used for the hair and the ears that defines the facial structure. Now we have the image underneath it, and this is where I would start working with the color layer. And you can see I actually have multiple layers here, so it's not as tidy as the template that I created for you to download. But I'm going to create an additional layer just to show you how this works. So using the Blob brush, again, I am going to remove the fill color and select the stroke, and I'm going to use one of the base colors. You can start with the brightest color, but I like to start with a mid-tone value, which could be either this or this color, but let's just start with this one. And I'm using the Blob brush, and at the first point I would make it quite big, and I will just paint around the edges of the face. Okay, something like this. It will look silly when I let go, but you'll see what we are doing here. Okay, so just very quickly creating that shape. Now notice how immediately it jumps underneath the black outlines because my layer is underneath it. So this is my color layer. I'm just going to name it, and these are my outlines. Okay. These are the crucial layers here. And you can even lock the outlines layer if you want to make sure you don't accidentally continue painting on that one. So this way I definitely work on the color layer. And then selecting this inner line using the direct selection tool, I can delete from it. Now, here's another important option. Under the view menu, there's two features, the show hide edges and the show hide bounding box. Notice that I use two shortcuts for them. So I use function 3 and function 4, but you can customize these to whatever you want. You can even use the default shortcuts for them, but I just prefer having access to them much faster. So the bounding box is when you have something selected, it shows this outline that you can grab and resize. That's the bounding box. So I can hide that, show that very quickly with my shortcut. And the edges are these outlines. So whenever I select something, the little anchor points and direction lines are showing. That's the show edges feature. If I hide them, I can't really see what I select, but that's how I like to draw. Especially with the Blob brush, you don't want the outlines constantly showing. So it's a useful shortcut that you can turn back and forth while working. So let's just select this, and I keep the edges on just so you can see what I'm doing. And I press backspace twice. So now it fills in the face with that base color. Now at this point, it becomes difficult to see the values and what we need to do here. So there's a useful shortcut, Command Y, to quickly switch to seeing the image at the bottom. Now, this will only show, and this is another important setting, this will only show if you go into the window menu, and under there you will find the links panel, and within the links you will see all the images you place into the Illustrator document. So here you can see I have a couple of images, but most importantly what you want to do is to select the one that you placed in, that you are using as a reference, and you right click or go to the panel menu and choose embed. Now you can see my one is already embedded. That little icon there shows it's embedded. And the main reason why you want to do this is to be able to see the image when in outline mode. If you are not embedding your reference image, you won't see it at all in the outline view. So you will just see a completely white backdrop. So outline view, and the reason I like to work with that is because I can very quickly switch back and forth between my illustration and the artwork. So if I want, I can even continue painting like this, and I won't really see the colors that I'm using, but it's still useful. So let me just go to my color layer, switch to my Blob brush, reduce the size of it, and I'm going to select this dark color, and I'm going to start painting here. So notice that I will only see the outlines, but that's enough because I can tell how far I need to go with this color. So while I'm looking at my reference photo, I can follow the outline and paint over it with this dark value. Then when I press Command Y, I can switch back to seeing my illustration. Now the next step would be to select a brighter shade of brown, and with that come over a bit and overlap that on the other shade. So let's see how that looks. Okay, I can go a bit further in here and also around the eyelid, maybe something like that. Then I can switch further down and I can come out a bit and maybe just mark for myself how far I need to come, something like this. Now, if I switch back, I can tidy this up and I can actually start using different shades as well. Like this one might work quite nicely. At the moment, you might feel like it's a big mess. And also you can see why I said that the edges can be distracting. So turning the edges off is definitely useful. So I just remove the edges so they are not showing at all. And I was actually using the wrong color here. And that's actually something that you don't have to repaint it. You can just select an object and choose whichever color you want to replace it with. Okay, that's the good thing about Illustrator, that everything is selectable easily. And this is basically how I would continue working with the shading. But this is when, once you start having details in place, it's good to have the reference on the side. So that way you don't have to always flick back and forth between outline view and your illustration, but you can just have your reference on the side. I'm just going to move this image a bit closer. So let's just select this one and move it a bit closer, something like that. So now if I zoom in, I can keep an eye on both versions and I can continue painting. So at this point, if I want, I can even just carry on painting without switching back and forth between the outline view and the normal view. And I can see where these darkest values need to go. So I will have to define details around the nose. That's also dark. I would also define this side here a bit more with the dark. And then let's start adding the brighter colors as well, like probably this bright color here on the left side. We want the stroke to be this color, and then that's going to be the highlight or brighter side of the face, and so on and so forth. So this is obviously very time consuming, so I won't continue doing it, but I'm going to show you the final result and how I refine the details. So I'm going to turn off this version and I'm going to turn back all my layers that I created and these layers as well. Okay, so you can see that there's a lot of detail added using all the different values. And when you look at the two, so when you try comparing the two, you can see that I was trying to follow as closely as possible to the tonal values on the reference image. So have the darkest details where they need to be, keep the eyes fairly neutral. You don't want the eyes to look glowing, especially when you look at the reference images from this graphic style used in Red Dead Redemption. They have the eyes quite neutral. And yeah, basically that's it. The hair as well can be just defined by adding some highlights. And then notice how I use the white, the brightest color, on the left side where the strongest light is coming from. It's almost like a rim light. It's only on the left side, and also on the shirt it's used on the left side. But what's important is to create these nice edge details. So this is something that you just have to do. You just need to be patient with this, and you need to work with a small brush. So I'm just going to reduce my brush size and show you how I do this. So it's good to keep some edges flat or sharp, but I quite like to add these almost like painterly edges in some places. So here again, maybe using this color, or that's not the same color, that's the shade. I can add some edge detail just to make it a bit more interesting. Same thing here. Anything that looks a bit too round or wonky, those details you want to refine. And here something happened which I wanted to demonstrate to you, because this can be very annoying if you don't know how to fix this or handle this. Notice I'm going to paint here. Okay, I keep painting. That's fine. It looks okay. Now it's not doing it. It was doing it before. But if I keep painting, after a while, things might jump to a different color. So the surrounding colors might start to blend with what I'm doing. And that is because the blend tool is trying to merge similar colored objects together. If that ever happens, so again, it's hard to demonstrate this. It sometimes happens, sometimes it doesn't. But if you can see it happening, the quickest fix for it is to start a new fresh layer. Okay, just start a new layer, and that's why I have multiple color layers here. Just start a new layer, and you can even lock your other layers to make sure that it doesn't keep blending with them. But normally I find that just simply creating a separate layer is going to already fix this problem. Okay, so we used for almost everything the blob brush and the eraser tool if you ever need to remove some details. But it's worth mentioning that if you want to finesse your results, you can also start using the brush tool. Now with the brush tool, you can use all kinds of different brushes, but probably the best ones are the art brushes. Now, there's a couple of categories that you can work with. So if you go into the artistic brush sets, you will find ink and paintbrush, and watercolor and chalk, depends what you want. But you can see I have a few of these brushes already here, like this one. And with this brush, I can select, let's just say I'm going to select which color shall we work with, maybe this one. If I paint with this, you see it creates a huge detail. Okay, it's massive at the moment, but of course we can reduce the size of this. And the way you do that is by clicking on this drop down, double click on whichever art brush you are working with, and just reduce the width here. Once again, if you are using a pen tablet, you can set this to pen pressure, but I'm not going to worry about that because we've seen that before. I'm going to reduce it to 24%, and let's see how this looks now. Okay, it's a bit more manageable. If I draw a longer line, that's how it looks. We can also go back, double click, and choose scale proportionally. Now that's interesting because then if I draw a shorter line, it's going to keep it within that size. So the longer lines I draw, the bigger it gets. The small lines will get really small. So I use the brush tool like this. So you can see that every tool just needs a little bit of customization, and you don't need to download any fancy brush sets in Illustrator. Using the default ones already are going to create really good results. So you can see I have just a very simple edge here, but if I want to make this a little bit more textured, then I can use my brush and see how much nicer it can get straight away. I might have made this too small now, so we can't really see what I'm doing. I'm just going to draw an edge here on this side. So using the the brush tool, I can create a little bit of edge on that side. And then I can keep changing my color as well and use the same textured brush here. And maybe if I just draw into it and I just make the scale a bit bigger because I realize it's a bit too small now. Let's just make it bigger. By the way, if you are changing any preferences, Illustrator is going to ask you whether you want to apply these changes to the previously drawn brush strokes. You don't want to do that, so just choose Leave Strokes, and then the new brush strokes are going to be using that new setting that you selected. And you can see how this already starts to look a bit more textured than before. I just zoom a bit closer, and again, let me just paint in here. Okay, so it can create a bit more random textured look than what we have here currently. Once again, let's just select this, and I'm going to use the brush tool and paint out in that direction. And by the way, if I want to do this the same direction, it's going to always go whichever direction I'm painting to. And there's one more important option when you work with brushes, and that is to make sure that the colorization is set to tints. So you don't want to set it to none, because then it's always going to use whatever color the brush was saved with. So you want to make sure it's set to tints, because that's going to allow you to work with the brush and choose whatever color you wish to apply on it. So this is all you need to do in Illustrator. As I said, it takes a couple of hours to get to a result like what you can see here, but there's one additional step that I would do at the end in Photoshop. And the way you can take your artwork into Photoshop is just simply by selecting everything. Make sure that nothing is locked that you need. So select all, Command or Control A, Command C or Control C, then go into Photoshop and press Command or Control V and make sure you choose Smart Object, which is going to create a vector smart object, which is very useful. So it's going to link your Photoshop document and your Illustrator document. By the way, I have the background already placed here into Photoshop, so I broke that in separately because I like to keep my character illustration on a separate layer and the background on a separate layer as well. So I'm going to set it up as a vector smart object and place it into the background. So we have it right here, okay? And what we need to do is to add that additional texture. Now for this, you can find a texture image online. You can search for grunge texture. That's how I found the one that I'm using as well. And I'm going to copy this layer so you can see how it looks. Just paste it in here, delete the mask from it and set it to normal. So that's my texture layer, okay? I'm going to make it a bit smaller so we can see the full texture, okay? It's a quite nice one, but it's not something you must use. If whatever similar texture you find on the internet, just place that on top of your artwork. Of course, it's good to find an image that is licensed or free to use. So it's good to check that before you start using it, especially if you are planning to sell your artwork at the end. So once you have the texture in place, you want to set the blend mode to multiply. You can also check the other blend modes, so you can just scroll through them, but I would say almost all the time I would use multiply for these type of textures, and you can see what it adds to our artwork. So it makes a big difference, but you don't want this to be added on the background. So you will create a clipping mask between these two layers. Alt click between the two of them will make sure that the texture will only affect your illustration. So when I turn it on and off, you can see how it looks. And then you want to make sure it doesn't apply on the skin, only on the shirt or the clothes and objects. So to make sure it doesn't go on the face, you can add a layer mask. Click on the little icon on the bottom right and then use the brush tool, and you can set it up a bigger brush size and use it with black to remove details that you don't need. So we don't need any texture here on the face, and we don't need texture on the arms, and that's it. So you can see now if I select both of these layers, I can move them in place wherever I want it. And if you turn on and off the texture, that's how it looks. But there's another cool thing when you set up a vector smart object in Photoshop, and that's the fact that you can still go back to making changes to your illustration. So all you have to do is to double click on the vector smart object thumbnail. So the layer's thumbnail, double click on it. It opens up the artwork, and let's just maybe change the shirt color because I feel like it's a bit lost on that red background. So what I'm going to do is to select those details. So the details that I use for the shirt, which I actually have on separate layers. So just to make it easier to select them, and then go to this icon here, which is called Recolor Artwork. Click on that. And this is a brilliant feature. If you switch to edit mode and click on that little chain, it's going to keep a harmony between the colors you use. So I have these two colors, the brighter and darker brown colors. Now they are linked to each other, so I can just move them together and you can see that they change at the same time. So I think I use something more similar along the lines of this blue. I click OK, and all you have to do in Illustrator is to save this, not save as, just simply file save, Command S, so Control S. And once it's saved, When we go back to Photoshop, it's going to automatically update here without affecting our other layers, including the texture. And there you go. So we have the blue shirt. And the best thing is that because the two applications are linked, you can undo the changes here in Photoshop. So if I press Command Z, we can see before, and Command or Control Shift Z, you can go forward. So that's just amazing because we don't have to keep going back and forth between the two applications. I can check which one works better. I can zoom out and see that this actually stands out more from the background. So there's a bit more contrast there. And by the way, if you are interested, what's the font that I used for the text here? This is called Marston. John Marston is another character from the game. He was the main character in Red Dead Redemption 1. So just look for free font Marston and you can download it and then you can work with that. I used the bold version of that and I just added a drop shadow to make it similar to the style that they use for the artwork. So now you know everything that you need to be able to turn any reference photo into the Red Dead Redemption graphic style. But also you've learned a lot of techniques that you can use in general for doing illustrations. But to help you get started, make sure you download the file that I included in the description, which has everything there already, the background, the colors, the layer setup, the way I explained them. But there's also a link in the description to this pin board on our Pinterest account where you can find a couple of reference images. So you can see the graphics here, and these are high resolution pins that I created. So you can also download them if you want. But more importantly, you have a couple of really cool reference photos that you can work with. If you want, you can use my photo as well and practice with that, or pick any of these other ones from famous movies and TV shows. By the way, Hell on Wheels is my favorite Western series. If you haven't seen it already, and if you love Red Dead Redemption and in general this genre, then make sure you check it out because it's an awesome series. And I'm tempted to do another illustration based on this reference photo. But what's very important is that when you are ready with your illustration, you can actually upload it to this same pin board. So let's just say you were working on the image of myself. If you want to add your final result here, you can choose Add Photo. So clicking on that, you can just drag and drop your final result, which you saved out as a JPEG or PNG, and then we will be able to see it and everyone else will be able to comment on your work. So that would be an amazing thing to see, how you turn this photo into an illustration. But also you can choose any of these other ones. If you don't want to keep staring at my face for hours, then feel free to grab any of these. And I hope you will find this a fun project to work on to improve your illustration skills. Let us know in the comment section what would you like us to cover next time. You can also share links to images you would love to learn how to recreate. Click on the link in the description and become a member if you want to work on future projects with us and see the whole process live. Thanks a lot for watching. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it. Have fun learning, guys, and I will see you in the next one.